I'm David Walsh. Welcome to my desolate kingdom. And today, this very special day, I have next to me Matthew Barney. So welcome to his... Welcome to Matthew's tortured world of integrity. And our interlocutor over there is Elizabeth Pearce, and she's here because, frankly, I don't know what I'm talking about. And
no, he does. He just waffles a little. It's fine. It's fine.
I'm here to learn from these two erudite individuals. So I did have a few questions to ask, but I don't know if you saw the article in the Australian today. They asked all the ones that I was interested in knowing the answer to. The key one was, is Matthew a filmmaker or a sculptor? He said he was a sculptor, and that basically nailed everything that I needed to know.
So you should actually just head straight back out and go and get the paper, and we're done here.
I was going to do that, Jake. That's why we should get our act together before we start. Earlier this week, the integrity and focus that Matthew has going along with the charm was illustrated to me when someone told me about, what's it called, Imperial Mask? Is that a work that hopefully you'll all see tonight, Imperial Mask, which one of the staff asked Matthew, how do you clean Imperial Mask? And Matthew said, you don't get it dirty, that's how you clean it. So that's the focus that we're dealing with, and I'm sure, and I hope that, before I let them do the things that they do so well, how many people went and saw River of Fundament last night? And did you take both hands, or that's a lot of people, and I guess most of you will be going today, is that right? Yeah, so...
Those three. Oh, we get four.
Yeah. Both of her, yeah. That's what we expected, so the focus will be on... We'll be on the exhibition. This is an exhibition that requires some effort to appreciate. It's aesthetically beautiful. It has deep profundity. Can you have deep profundity? Is profundity profound enough?
You can now, yeah.
But more than anything we've done at Mona so far, it requires a little bit of effort to get into, and I hope that Mona has earned that effort. I know that Matthew, certainly in his body of work, has. So Elizabeth is going to do some sort of introduction. So Elizabeth, do some sort of introduction, please.
I'm going to do some sort of introduction. It has taken a lot of work for my colleagues and I to get our heads around. It's been absolutely fascinating and at times slightly overwhelming. So I just wanted to put a few things down on paper to get us started. So I'm a writer and research curator at Mona. David and my colleagues and I have a long-standing interest in demystifying the figure of the artist. This is one reason Matthew Barney's River of Fundament has been so fascinating and challenging for us. Matthew's project is about, among many other things, the nature of creativity, its genesis, its propagation via influence on other artists, and ultimately the question of whether creativity is a form of immortality. River of Fundament flirts with, but ultimately refuses the idea of a spirit of creativity that is passed down from one generation to the next. This is a seductive idea. Firstly, it's a secular indulgence of a Christian notion, that of a soul to house the creative essence in the first place. It's also a lovely immortality fantasy. The artist's creative genius lives on in his or her successors, providing some relief from the ever-encroaching fear we all feel for our eventual annihilation. Thirdly, and now I come to the point of this little introduction, the idea of a spirit of creativity allows us to hold its hosts, artists, to higher moral standards, to make them the idols, priests, and gods of our godless age. Artists should not be charged with this responsibility, I think. It's dangerous to believe in artists in this way, for the same reason that wholehearted acceptance of any doctrine is dangerous. It's toxic to vibrant, pluralistic thinking. More than that, turning our artists into false prophets is bad for art itself.
But true prophets is okay?
Well, we'll find out whether, over the course of this conversation. It's bad for art because we tend to look for the wrong things in it. We ask, is it good in a moral sense? Is it good for us? And when the work fails to catapult us to a higher moral realm, we get angry and accuse its maker of perversity, depravity, and pettiness. Art should help us better know our nature and make the best of it, not to catapult us falsely beyond it. Art should not be put to the surface of the revelation of truth. And I think this is something that we might come back to, David, as we were chatting about yesterday. But to the lifelong process of changing your mind. I'm nearly done. This is not to say art should not be held to high standards. It should, but the right standards. In order to open and change our minds, it must first arrest us with its vision, assail us with its insight, and astound us with its craft. In my opinion, Matthew Barney's River of Fundament achieves this. You can decide if you agree with me when you see the film, if you haven't already, and most of you have, so that's great, and the exhibition at Mona, which opens tonight. In my view, Matthew's work turns the power of the artistic myth against itself, giving us a starting point for imagining a new mythology, one where the depravity, perversity, and pettiness of the human spirit sits alongside its audacity, empathy, and ingenuity. So, these are pretty grand charges to lay at your door, Matthew, but River of Fundament is deniably a grand and ambitious work. To what extent would you say that your original concept resembles the final project, the final outcome?
Very little, actually. The initial idea was to really turn my filmmaking practice on its head and abandon it, really, and to perform scenes in front of an audience. And so the original concept then was to perform the entire piece live. And when Jonathan Bepler and I first started thinking about how this could happen, we were considering opera houses, we were considering like a traditional approach to a proscenium stage. We then moved on. We did a small sketch in Manchester on a stage, and then moved on to site-specific locations, thinking that each of these soul states that are described in Mailer's novel Ancient Evenings would be a different site and a different action. And we even started on that. We started with Regen in Los Angeles, which was performed live in 2008, and then Coup in Detroit in 2010. And I was filming those performances and not really knowing how I was going to use that material, and started cutting it together and feeling like although it had an undeniable energy to it, particularly if you were there, but as cinema or as moving image, it lacked a point of view, basically, that these were an array of objective cameras were set up, and it just captured what happened. And so it was certainly a departure from what I was doing, and that's what I wanted, but there wasn't enough intensity captured by the camera. So I started changing the idea and mixing together performed scenes with scenes that were staged for the camera, and that's where it ended up. But that process took years. It took seven years to arrive at that, really, or to complete it anyway. So, and somehow I made my way back to being interested in making a film again, which feels good, because I had really lost it. Really didn't have an interest in doing it. After drawing Restraint 9, I was pretty much done.
Over 7 years is a long time to stay focused on one project. Did you feel like you were losing your way at any point during that time?
Yeah, for sure, and in a good way. It was unknown territory for me. To perform live that way was was not natural for me, I think, to sort of reveal all of the failures and errors and chance that naturally happens in a situation like that, particularly when it's big and physical like that. There's sort of no way of one of those things going off as planned.
Yeah.
And that was really the intention from the start. But I think, in Cremaster there were moments like that, but they were private,
Yeah.
and that burden was shared by us as a company, as a production team. But we were also the audience to some incredible things that were happening on those sets, and that's really where this project started. It was talking about those experiences we had shared, and how incredible they were, and that if only somebody could join us and witness that.
So revealing yourself and revealing your weaknesses and your failures as an artist to an extent was part of your modus operandi in this project, as opposed to just an inevitable outcome.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Do you think in general that the product ever resembles the original conception in art, or in certainly in your art?
Sometimes.
So it can happen.
It can happen.
It can be.
Yeah.
Even though randomness plays a big part and scale, and another thing I learned in the Australian this morning, so everything I know comes from the Australian, but there was a brilliant comment that you made in answer to a question regarding why you work on such a scale, and it was essentially that losing control is an essential element of the process, and that's the best answer I think I've ever heard to why people do things big.
Mm-hmm. For sure, yeah. You learn, right? You over time you become better at what you're doing, and the proficiency becomes an enemy. Really.
Can you get bigger than this? Proficiency is an enemy. There you go.
I mean, I don't know if it's about blowing something up in scale. It's sort of more about complexity, I think.
Yeah, but yeah, but I know from conversations that you're always trying to do bigger pours, bigger cars,
right?
And more conceptually whole, and the conceptual completeness comes from the fact that the product can't be forecast, in part at least. Is that true?
It's true. I also feel like it could happen if you got really small. That could also work.
But is it in some way about making it hard for yourself? Is that something that is it's in a way you make it hard for the audience in the sense that the durational nature of the film and the scale and the density of references that you're mobilizing in the film and in the exhibition. Do you have a sense that you're asking your audience to step up to the mark, because that's what you've done as an artist? You've kind of put yourself through almost a trial to achieve what you have, and you're asking your audience to do the same?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that both Jonathan and I were interested in doing was to place this work in houses where one would be used to seeing an evening-long durational work, a place that presents experimental opera or, longer symphonic works or, things with an interval, rather than showing them in art house cinemas where, learning from the Cremaster cycle that, that there's a flexibility with that audience to a certain extent. But it's not, I don't believe that this film would have functioned well in art house cinemas, because I think the expectation for it to function as a piece of entertainment would fail them.
Yeah.
And I think, I think there's a number of reasons why we wanted to place it in opera houses, proscenium theaters, philharmonics like we did here. Part of it is the acoustics, part of it is the comfort of the seating, a place to go for intermission, practical things, but there's also the expectation. And in that way, I think we were thinking about what the audience would bring to the piece. And So yes, we have been thinking in those terms.
What would you like from your audience? What would be? Do you think about your ideal reaction, like to someone to walk away and be profoundly emotionally affected, or to think, or does it bother you that people might not always, and they couldn't possibly, I know I can't, unravel all of the references that you're using and the complexity of the storyline?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think about how the audience receives the work?
Well, I think there are many different ways that it can happen, and I mean, I think the situation we have here is unique because I think the work can be read through all of its media, and that's special. It doesn't happen very often. You know, that here we have the sculpture and drawing and the storyboards and the Egyptian collection at Mona and the intervention that the work makes with that and the film, and I think what I would love to see happen, and I think what will happen here, is for connections to be made between all of those things.
Is any one element something you'd consider to be the most distilled aspect of your vision or your concept, or the most important?
I mean, I've always felt the drawings were that. I think this particular group of sculpture is as much that as the drawing. Mm-hmm. I think that the sculpture that came out of Drawing Restraint 9, for example, or Cremaster were more I mean, I think they were more hybrid in nature, and in terms of their relationship to the narrative, they were less autonomous. Mm-hmm. I think I feel these works are different in that way, that they of course relate back to the narrative, and they are narrative works, but they also relate very strongly to the tradition of sculpture, and and they have that relationship.
David, I know you've been thinking for a long time about Matthew's work, and I was just wondering, after last night and sitting down and experiencing the opera film, how has your understanding shifted?
I think I understand it less. To create some context about, I first engaged Matthew's work only 7 years ago, which is actually less duration than the time it's taken to create this body of work. So I'm not really engaged at all, but I made a big attempt last night to follow. It was the first time I'd seen it. I'd seen some outtakes before it was edited at Matthew's studio in Long Island City, and I had seen the exhibition, which has become a component of our exhibition at Mona. I hadn't, distilled it into a gestalt, if that makes sense, if you can have little, and I still haven't. I will still return to the exhibition a number of times, and I might, somewhat to my surprise, sit through the whole thing again. I certainly understand Matthew's comments about the integrity of the Opera House, because, it has, I felt like, as much as anything, the film is an opera. Before, I felt like its antecedents aren't Caravaggio, they're more Wagner. And as soon as I fell into the mode of seeing it as an experimental piece with deliberate overcompensation for the lack of understanding, high-level performances, overstatement of themes, elegant imagery interwoven with, or say juxtaposed with, essentially Tourette-type interjections. I felt like I was watching something from the 18th century, well, the 19th century, I guess, with those sort of values, and I then gave up trying to understand every modality and just letting it overwhelm me, which it did. You know, it's like I saw enough shit being dribbled on the screen last night to be up here dribbling shit now about it, but the overall...
that you're dribbling shit, by the way. That's what
Yeah,
that applause is.
when I dribble shit, that's the funny bit. That's a worry. The overall change in my bearing was to let the waves overwhelm me rather than, you know, to wait for the lifesaver rather than to attempt to swim against the current.
So do you think that not understanding is here a kind of a productive state as opposed to something that closes you down or
I
alienates?
never think that. But I was...
That's my friend's vagina, apparently.
Yeah.
That
We were going to leave that as an in-joke, but Emily couldn't leave it alone.
that Matthew drew on the sand. Yeah. I think that it's in there just to really torture our curators who would kind of like us to take this seriously. So David decided to sorry, Nicole and Olivier.
That is Matthew's major contribution to the Tasmanian landscape. Fortunately, it was in a tidal zone. Otherwise, someone would be trying to buy it. Now I've lost my train of thought.
What I'm
Elizabeth,
asking,
do it again.
What I'm asking is, not understanding the work is a productive state for you here. It's not something that alienates you from it. It's something that invites you in.
I think that's never the case. I think understanding is always worthwhile, but I don't think that not understanding is the opposite of value. While I can appreciate, for example, I can go and see the show, as I did in Munich. A lot of the objects have their presence, their grandeur. Some of them are beautiful, some of them are exactly not beautiful. They occupy the same space that I allocate to an industrial wasteland, but they have presence, and then that presence garners the capacity to inform as I learn. So the entree is emotion, and emotion is an evolutionary state that we access automatically and easily. Understanding is often a cultural state that requires us to sit around here and you know, chew the fat.
Well, the emotion of the film is incredible. Actually, the sculptures as well, incredibly emotional for me anyway. What about you as the maker? Is creativity an emotional state or more of a rational state for you?
I mean, there are more rational beginnings to certain aspects of the work, but I think quite soon it becomes its own thing. It becomes its own organism, and we follow it, and it definitely develops its own emotive force, and that's when it gets exciting for me. And I think the same could be said of the objects in the sense that, you know, there are various forms of transformation that happen in the making of these things. You know, sometimes like the cast iron work at the end of Act 2, which unfortunately is not on view in the show here, but that piece has a kind of a presence that I believe can only come from the way that it was made. And that was that it was invested with the sacrifice of the protagonist. You know, that it's something like, you know, early forms of metallurgy where the body of a warrior is thrown into the fire to, you know, anneal the blade or the sword, and to capture the fighting spirit of that warrior in the sword. And I think that piece has that for me, that kind of presence. And you know, that's not a rational process or even a rational goal, you know.
But doesn't throwing the body in actually carbonize the steel? Like, didn't that actually work?
It did work, yeah.
So, you know, sometimes myth structures are a way of accessing reality as well. Particularly, you know, when myth structures have the virtue of deep time.
Did you have in your conception the idea of creating your own mythology?
I think that the more mythological narratives, like the Egyptian narrative in this case, are, you know, to do with needing a host body. You know, that I think what I do is relatively formless. And it needs support. It needs a host body. And so my narrative moves from host body to host body, you know, from project to project. And in this case, Egyptian mythology is part of that body. And I think mythologies that we all share are, you know, you can ask that of them. They have that potential to be host bodies, you know, whereas, you know, there are other types of narratives that are more closed and they're not shared and they're harder to inhabit temporarily, you know, and move through.
What are you trying to do with that mythology? Is it something that you want to actually affect the way we live our lives, the way we think about ourselves and each other, or are you merely creating it as a kind of an exercise of virtuosity, or is it something that you'd actually like to achieve some kind of change or impact?
Well, I mean, I'm interested in the transformation of my work passing through a narrative and resulting in some kind of a form that, you know, that has the energy of that narrative and of my own process within that narrative. So it's the transformation that I need. And I don't feel like I can say it much better than you did in your introduction, that, you know, that Mailer's Ancient Evenings sort of has a lot of the dualities that I need from a text, that it, you know, that it has, you know, aspects of you know, the way that it treats the way that it treats waste and the way that it treats more transcendental states sort of equally, and the way that they're interdependent, and you know, the way that the gods are described in the same sort of the same way in terms of their depravity and their magic.
Yeah.
And,
How many people here have read Ancient Evenings? The whole thing? No one?
Sickos.
Oh, one. Wow.
No, there's someone up there. There are a couple of people.
Can you tell me what happens? Because
yeah. Does everything turn out okay? I've read about half. You've read it all, haven't you?
more or less.
More or less.
I actually had a colleague and I were discussing this, was saying, oh, come on, as if he's going to work on this for 7 years and not read the whole book. That's fantastic. So I was thinking of a way of sort of dressing up this question to make it sound more deep than it really is. But the question I want to know, is it a good book or not? Or is it crap? I mean, I suppose you don't know.
What do you think?
You have to ask that guy. Really, what I want to know is, are you trying to do service to this book? Do you think it's misunderstood, or is its problematic status a part of your own interpretation? Is it something that you're trading on?
I think it's helpful that it's problematic, but I think what I need from certainly not from every let's say external body that I work with, but in this case I needed it, which is that I need to love it and hate it both. You know, it needs to be problematic on certain levels for me to engage with it in the way that I have in this case.
In what way is it problematic?
I mean, I think that, you know, there are Mailer books that I love, you know, Executioner's Song, for example. But I think this is one of those books where his voice gets in the way of the, what he's trying to achieve. And I can only hear him saying, speaking these lines, which feels a little bit problematic. So I think that there's, it's easy to interpret the protagonist as being Mailer himself in all of the frustrations of the protagonist that, and I don't know if that was his intention to the extent that it feels that way. But I think I needed that. I needed for there to be that kind of problem with the book. Mm-hmm.
You say that his voice gets in the way. Is that something that you think about in your own work, about the place of your own voice and whether that gets in the way or whether that's actually a conduit?
I feel that way less with this work. I think that the Cremaster cycle, for example, had an autobiographical structure to it. And I think there were moments in that project where I felt like the rules that I had set up to follow were often getting in the way of, making the best decisions for a given scene, something like that.
The rules?
Rules, yeah.
Like, what kind of rules?
The scenes that were filmed in Scotland and Ireland in Cremaster 3, for example, and the way that the orange and green factions were established between the Scottish giant and the Irish giant, and there was a certain mythological context for that, but there was also a kind of very complicated autobiographical context for that in terms of my lineage, which is both Catholic and Protestant, and parts of my family were divided, Catholic and Protestant, and it became very loaded for me. But I wanted to kind of keep that conflict present through the whole, through that whole scene, and then eventually through the entire Cremaster 3 narrative. So. It establishes a set of rules, both to do with art direction and to do with writing, which sometimes gets in the way.
Well, you obviously place yourself in the work in a very interesting and complicated way. Is it? My interpretation was that you're trying to use yourself as a passage somewhere else. So you're turning the spotlight on yourself, but not for the purpose of self-analysis, but for the purpose of to try and get at a greater truth or take the story somewhere else. I don't know if I'm expressing my question very well, but I was wondering if the problematic nature of Ancient Evenings for me is that Mailer more generally is that that self-analysis is a dead end, that he doesn't really take it anywhere else. Do you agree with that? And David, what do you think about that?
Well, the first 100 pages of Ancient Evenings goes nowhere. I might have got to 200, but I think I was asleep before. I think Matthew answered the question exactly the way I would have, which is that he's too intrusive on the page. He admires Hemingway, but Hemingway comes through in a way that Hemingway put really well. The elegance of the movement of Hemingway's page is because it's like an iceberg. 9/10 of it is invisible. Right? With Mailer, it's all visible. You can see the machinations of his mind, how he's trying to manipulate the reader. He wants you to think what he wants you to think. There are no avenues for you to prosecute your own interpretation of the page, and to me that is a component of what makes art interesting. So to juxtapose that with Matthew's work, I think the imbiber, it really is, a passion. and you take it where you want to go, and that probably is the answer I should have given to the question before, which was about understanding. Understanding is useful, but it's useful when you garner it yourself with a bit of effort, not when it's given to you in a Damien Hirst sort of way, because there's and I'm not, you know, there's plenty of Damien Hirst work I like, but most of it is incredibly superficial. It's you engage it, you know what he's on about. It doesn't take a degree. In fact, a degree probably would hamper the understanding of it, and the price that the work generates is inversely proportional to the depth that it possesses. So I think if, you know, you should steal your favourite Damien Hirst work, whereas Matthew's work is something that could possibly hold you, possibly that could grow on you. I suspect that there are works, if you see something with Damien Hirst and you like it, the joke's going to be funny forever. And an engagement with a Barney exhibition, that's different. You're going to change your mind as you change, because it is as much about, and art in general that's worthwhile, is as much about the viewer as the creator. But I don't think artists necessarily agree with that, but novelists often do. So Mailer is the exception, because he just, his ego is so fragile that he's obliged to insert himself at every note.
Is the way you just described Matthew's work reflect what you're trying to achieve at Mona more broadly? I'm
not sure that the goals that I have now are that interesting, because they're not the same as they were a few years ago, and I suspect that they won't be the same in a few years. That notwithstanding, there is an element that Mona is about devaluing the autocratic structure so that the viewer can feel that their opinion is as meritorious, or as, you know, in terms of the classic axiology, it has the value of the presentation system. So no viewpoint is privileged, and that makes participation easy. Like, I'm pretty sure that if Mona is interesting, one of the reasons it's interesting is because when I built it, I didn't know what I was doing, and I was going through an experience that is garnering information. It is a learning experience, and essentially I drag everyone along with me, and hopefully they don't feel that they're in a position where they're having wisdom inculcated into them, because to begin with I didn't know what I was talking about, and I still probably don't. And just like I'm here with Matthew learning, you know, and I have learned things, you know, if I can learn from the Australian, then I really don't know anything. And that process by which we're on a ship, we've embarked on the journey. The journey has a bit of art, and we're floating on a sea of chance, and that sea is bearing us somewhere. The key point to me is the teleology, the idea that we know where the journey's taking us, is a load of crap. I like the idea that chance, I don't like the idea. I think reality has taught me that chance is a crucial component of the voyage that we're bound on, and we therefore should accept it wholeheartedly, or we're fighting the inevitable. So that might well be why Mona, I think at least, having seen the show, so you'll have to allow me to forejudge, works well with Matthew's work. I think there are great artists that don't really have any ideas, they just make things, and those things end up getting interpreted by critics, and the critics make something of them, and then there's this process by which the art is created after it was initially created. So the backgrounding, and I have no problem with that, but every now and again I encounter an artist that has conceptual value all the way through. Actually, the first, this is not going to work, dangerous trying to find a quote when you're, halfway through a sentence. So,
Talk
but I'm
amongst
going to do
yourselves.
it because this is so, and it actually references her. So maybe I'm just the first comment that appeared on our Facebook when we announced that we were doing an exhibition with Matthew said, "Oh man, fuck Hurst and his ilk. Barney is so deep and substantive, conceptually lucid and coherent. I ache with admiration. I almost daren't comment." That last bit's clearly not true. But
I'd say that's not a good representation of the quality of Facebook comments our page usually garners, but go on.
I only picked one. You'll note I only picked one, but it was the first one. And I like this idea that there's a destination, but you don't necessarily have to go there. That you're prepared to say, I want to achieve this, but you can get derailed, you can learn, you can process. Chance plays a part, but there is a substantive intellectual substructure, emotion, all of the things that fulfill us as human beings, and I hope Mona's got some of that, and I'm certain that Matthew has a great deal of that.
But from what you were saying earlier, that surrendering to that chaotic process is slightly uncomfortable for you, that kind of grates a little bit against other parts of your modus operandi. But I just wanted to ask in what way you feel like the meaning or the emphasis of your project has shifted in this Tasmanian incarnation.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically, Mona, of course.
Right. Well, there's a way that I tend to install exhibitions that has to do with creating a relationship from room to room in a way that is, that suggests a kind of processional. In other words, that the works themselves are moving through a space,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that is particularly effective here. Although it's something that I tend to do. I think what's different here is that the foundation for the work being the Egyptian subtext is present here physically. And so I think as the work passes through that in this exhibition, something else happens. And I think all of those relationships suddenly become different, while that, in the way that that's present here. And I think it isn't as simple as saying, well, you can set up a couple of canopic jars and votive figures and that will happen. I think it's more complicated than that. And I think in this case, I think it's to do with the possibility of actually combining the Egyptian work with my work in ways that would really not be possible in any other institution that I know of, to physically put them in contact.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's special. And I think it gets deeper into something that I'm very interested in.
Yeah.
In terms of a simultaneity, of time and place and which I think is alluded to in the films and sculpture and drawing, but in this case it becomes not literalized as much as just made physical, which is very special, I think.
Well, David, you've seen Matthew's work exhibited elsewhere. I was wondering, is it a different experience for you here?
It looks better here. Actually, obviously I would be inserting my bias in this. I saw the components of this exhibition that we have in common in Munich, and I found it very powerful in Munich. I find it even more powerful here, but I noticed that the gallery itself was finding it very hard to engage the community. And I had an issue with it that Matthew mentioned the processional in terms of the works creating the processional. I think the processional value of this is embedded in its mythology. I see in culture after culture this idea of creating objects that generate paths, like the lines and the planes in Nazca. They're, weirdos say that they're made for landing spacecraft. It seems more likely that they're processional paths that you walk around. And I feel whenever you engage in mythology, it's easiest to see it by, like touch typing. You don't know where the keys are except by typing. This processional component of it, of Matthew's, well, at least this exhibition, feels very strong to me. And in Munich, I didn't feel that I knew where to go. So here, I feel you do. I feel the options are limited. I hope that, because we won't be able to let a huge number of people in the galleries, and I might be making a virtue of necessity here, but there'll be some queuing. I like the idea of that engaging some mythological process. So I think the key elements that seem to be embedded in the mythology for me are procession, circularity, and concealment. And some of the things are concealed by being exposed.
Procession, circularity, and concealment.
Yes, so cycles, returning to where you start. This is conceptually there with, the Osiris, Horus, Seth, and Isis myth, which is that essentially Seth killed Osiris, Osiris' wife, reassembled him, fucked him, had a child is Horus. This reassembly was a temporary thing, and that's strongly present, right? But the bits are lost, not all the bits are found, because I think the penis wasn't found, at least in some retellings, and I think so circularity exists, in, say, in Scientology, or what's the Masons, Freemasons. There are levels that you're inducted into that reveal wisdom. So concealment is very logically important, but you return to a deeper facet of understanding of the same knowledge that was already present in your knowledge base. That's completely different than the way that secularity sees the world, which is that all knowledge is a substrate for acquiring new knowledge. So yeah, I see the myth structure as having a strong embedded, and so the concealment and the circularity are essentially the same thing. So the way it's presented at the moment, I think there's one path to go, one path to take. And to me, that's how it should be. I feel I'm giving a long-winded answer to a question, and it may not be what Matthew requires of his work, right? No, it may not be, it won't be. So this is, and I didn't make it look like this. It just looks like this to me. So it works better in Hobart because it satisfies these internal desires that I possess when I access mythology than it did in Munich.
I think what was in the way in Munich was Adolf Hitler, I mean, it was a collision of two processions, effectively, which I found very interesting, but, I think it felt a little bit more like a mausoleum than an active site.
I'm sure that might have been the case for, a lot of Germans that didn't want to again have to apply for readmission to the human race, but you didn't have that impact on me, like in Munich. But maybe I was, the atmosphere was foreshortening my vision. There is a companion aspect to that I see in Hobart, and that is this foreshortening of vision that is created by the fog of cultural cringe. And you might not have noticed this, or you might not even know about it, but there's a aspect of Tasmania that tends to see itself as a backwater, which is not so bad. And the bit that I find unbecoming is that there is a tendency to bask in this quagmire, to really enjoy the backwater status, and I'm pretty sure you answered it in a technical way, but I'm really interested in, like it said in the Australian, that you were here because of the Egyptian engagement, and you just said a similar thing now. But I think you made the decision before that, didn't you? Why is this your first show in Australia? Is there a reason why you weren't in Australia before, or did it just simply not happen?
I guess there was never a compelling. I mean, this is compelling to me. What is happening here, and there was never a compelling situation that came forward before this. But I think I'm also very interested in the destination, the notion of in this case, my journey to come here, and some other people who have made the trip to come here. I think I've made projects in Bahia, in Brazil, in the Isle of Man, in a number of places that are not central, and it's always been very satisfying to me to go to a place where there's a more visible, where the form is more visible somehow. It isn't obfuscated by the jillions of layers of things you have in a major city. Although that can be interesting.
I call it the scream of cultural bland.
Yeah, right? So I do enjoy making exhibitions in a place where you're free from that, and the thing that you make and the thing that we present can be seen very clearly, and it isn't. There isn't a lot of distraction from it, and.
I want to ask both of you about. Matthew, you were successful as an artist very early on, and you've garnered a number of prestigious prizes, and you're called the most important artist of the generation by New York Times and things like that. Does that have an impact on you in the way you work? Is it something that you try to keep out of your mind to stop it affecting you, or is it something that you revel in and enjoy?
Well, I mean, it has been. One of the things that we do at the studio, we spend a lot of energy on, a lot of time with, is communicating with people who we're interested in working with, who are not interested in working with us. A lot of time. Whether it's a oil refinery that produces sulfur as a byproduct, highly volatile, not interested in anybody getting anywhere near it, and we need tons of it, So I think having, some visibility and some success helps in those conversations a lot.
Don't you know who I am?
Well, no, I think you're able to call on institutions to send letters of recommendation. I think it's, it's enabled me to work at the scale that I work in certain ways.
Yeah, sure. But is there a sense that as an artist that you need to be outside the institution, and that somehow you're affected by, if you're sort of embraced by that, does that affect the way you work?
By institution, you mean museum? Or?
Well, I guess I have a slightly, maybe it's a romantic view of an artist, but to stand outside society and comment on it. But if you're wholeheartedly embraced, does that make it different? Does that cloud your vision in any way?
Well, I'm not wholeheartedly.
Which was the
embraced.
second half of my
for
question.
sure.
I wanted to know how you feel about, I mean, some of the early reviews of Fundament have been quite poisonous in varying degrees. Do you read the reviews, and does it affect, does that kind of criticism affect you?
I mean, I think at this point it's expected that, especially a work like this that's demanding in a number of ways, I would expect for it to divide its audience.
Do you have a sense of frustration?
Would you be disappointed if it didn't?
I would be disappointed if it didn't. Yeah.
I have that aspect too, but less so because I started to care what, you know, I think that my contrivance, this whole Mona thing, has certainly been tilted a little by its, at least within this community, it's the positive response. So, much to my surprise, I care. But I'm sure, had no one liked it, I would have been able to labour under the illusion, which wouldn't not have been an illusion, that, you know, I'm a crusader. So you can adapt your process to whatever response you receive, or indeed to no response at all.
Do you think that the accolades that you've received, David, and just be reassured that we are bitching about you behind your back, but the accolades, do you think that that's changed you for the better or worse, or not at all?
But I wouldn't have been now what I was then anyway. So I would have to compare myself to a ghost of something that never happened. I'm not interested at all in where I was.
Do you like yourself more in this incarnation?
Do you like me more?
I work for you, so yes.
That means yeah. I would happily give everyone a job if that was the... I'm not sure
actually,
that...
it's now the time...
I'm not sure that everyone that works for me necessarily likes me.
I was actually going to ask you about a pay rise as well. Is this the good time to talk about it?
And you, do you know what your new career is going to be? I suggest maybe you be on the ABC. They're into budget cuts. Sorry. Elizabeth, it is...
Oh, time for audience participation.
Would anyone like to ask a question? No? Good.
This lady here put her hand up very quickly.
And if you haven't got a microphone that we can put you near, I'm probably going to repeat the question because we're recording it. So I can't see anyone.
It comes along.
Go ahead.
Oh, you have got a microphone, okay.
Oh, okay, good.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you about the team that you've put together. I wanted to ask you, where did you find all these extraordinary actors, and in particular the musicians, and about the composer that didn't seem to rate a mention in your conversation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, Jonathan Bepler, I've worked with since the beginning of the Cremaster cycle. That's quite a long time ago now, and of course we worked in a different way in those years. It was more largely scored after the film was cut in a more traditional way. There were certain scenes where musicians were present in those films, and that, in a way, was the seed of our approach here. You know, to make an entire work where the music is present in the image, and that that a musicality grows out of every scene. You know, as a way of engaging with the tradition of opera, I guess. And we worked together on the casting, although Jonathan probably more so in terms of assembling the, let's say, the players, or the chamber group within the house, and the string ensembles, and we worked together more on the principal characters who were sometimes speaking and sometimes singing, and tried to find some people who were either trained musicians or not. You know, in some cases he was more interested in having somebody who was willing to go for it musically but had no skill necessarily. And in other cases, to have classically trained singers and to create a balance between those things. So there's also a way in which Jonathan works that's sort of half written and half improvised. And I think that influenced the casting, that there's a number of improvisers in there who are used to, taking direction without, written music. And then there are others who needed written material. And I think, as long as we're talking about Jonathan, I think what's most special about him as a composer is the choreography of the musicians, and the way that he treats the space, or the way that he responds to a situation that's been created sculpturally or architecturally, and has an interest in placing the musicians in different positions around that space, and that certainly influences the way that the music is mixed in the film, and the way that certain instruments only exist in the rear surrounds and others in the side. It's a very unconventional way of mixing music for film, and it's special. It's another reason why working in these bigger houses was of more interest, so that kind of dynamic would feel live in a way, rather than the way in which the acoustics in a cinema are dead, effectively, that it's designed so that every seat in the house sounds the same, whereas an opera house, it really changes depending on where you're sitting. And that was of interest, to try to show the film in places where there was aliveness to the sound.
I think was it down here?
Yeah, I'm interested in the scripted, acted scenes within the film, and wondering if you approach those in what would be termed a traditional filmmaking process, like using actors who we know from Hollywood who would go through a process of takes and retakes. Did you do that in the same way, or did you approach it the same way you do with your sculptures and your more performative pieces?
It really depended on the scene. There were some things in this production that were very new to me in that way. I haven't really worked with actors of that nature much in the past, like Paul Giamatti, for example, and that scene in the throne room with he and John Mailer that was approached in a very traditional way, with plenty of rehearsal and script changes and multiple takes and a careful continuity and all of that business. It's a little bit new to me, that, but whereas there are other scenes that are more really directed by the situation, and the situation gives the actor something to work with, and there's far less need for me to direct in a way, and I think that's probably what I'm better at, is creating that situation.
Who are the Native Americans? Are they Lakota? And how did they feel about being, soiled and costumed like that? They seem in the U.S. to really need a lot of respect around their performance. So I'm just wondering, can you tell us how you engaged them and what that was like?
Well, Norman III is a Lakota man, and the jury was a kind of multinational group, a music group. They're based in Connecticut, but they come from a number of nations, and these kinds of questions were more present with them than with either Norman III or the Ka of Norman, who were more in sort of solo kind of musical situations. I think that the drum group was, we did speak a lot about the way in which they would be represented, and the way in which we wanted to, or I wanted to work with the kinds of appropriations that, when you go to a powwow, for example, on a reservation, and you see the things that the guys in these drum groups are wearing, it's often, either, coming from rap culture, or like specifically reappropriating things like Washington Redskins jerseys or Chicago Blackhawks. They're sort of taking those those images that have been called racist for years, and they're kind of wearing them, and they're sort of, it's similar to rap culture in that way. The way that the reservation or the res is sort of worn as a badge of honor, and so that was the conversation we were having in the beginning in terms of the clothing they would be wearing. And as far as the watermark, that carries through the entire film. So that was sort of what we all had to deal with, I think, was to be, chest high and excrement. That was the condition. But I think it was something they got their heads around, they enjoyed.
All right.
Maybe this is a question for both of you.
Are you dressed as James Lee Byers? Sorry, go on.
So Hemingway haunts Mailer during each of his attempts at attaining immortality. Who haunts you during yours?
Can you say that again?
Good question.
Hemingway haunts Mailer during his attempts at attaining immortality. Who haunts you during yours?
I think there have been a number of, artists who have, Richard Serra's presence in Cremaster 3 and Byers in this work that, these are artists that I respect deeply and think about a lot. And I think that there's something comforting about inviting them into, inviting that influence into the work in a direct way. There was an exhibition made a number of years ago with the Guggenheim, with the work of Joseph Beuys and my work, and that similarly felt really, it was a relief to just set up that kind of conversation without, to sort of dispel that anxiety.
To exercise him.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much for coming. Thank you so much, Matthew. Thank you, David.
Thanks.